So yeah, we've got Delyth, Vice-county plant recorder for Denbighshire. So she'll be giving you a lot of the specifics behind recording plants and how to improve the quality of your own records. And Aisling will be taking you through our Covenant recording systems. So we have quite a new system in place, actually. I don't know exactly how long it's been in place, a few months now, certainly, but it's far more sophisticated than the old system and a lot more easy to use. So there'll be a few tricks that you may not be aware of, so it'll be worth watching that section and getting familiar with this new system. I'll just give you a brief introduction about recording, nothing too heavy, just a light touch thing, and then Aisling and Delyth will tell you more details. Okay, so brief course outline. I guess it'll take about an hour and a half. It may overrun a little bit if we've got questions at the end, so don't worry about that. So yeah, first bit will be a basics from me, just refreshing what makes a record. Then I'll hand over to Aisling, who will take you through our new ORS system. And then obviously we'll hand you over to Delyth later. We'll probably save all the questions to the end of the whole session rather than do the questions by each part. So Delyth's bit will be approximately 30 minutes. I guess it will be more like 3/4 of an hour, possibly longer, but we'll see how we get on. And then obviously plenty of time to ask Delyth about some of the more particulars about recording plants. Recording is basically the 4 W's. So what do I mean by that? Well, what have you actually seen? That's obviously critical. So you can either record things by the common name or the scientific name. So we've got common daisy there, Bellis perennis. The where, very important to state where you've actually seen these things. So nice to give a good geographical location. So things like a town name, a sort of geographical feature like the Great Orme's Head or something like that. But don't use sort of very sort of particular terms like my garden, because you've got to think that's a fairly meaningless term when somebody else is looking at it. It might mean a lot to you as a recorder, but to somebody looking at your record, it's not particularly helpful. So just think about that when you're applying a site name to a record. Obviously, the critical thing is a grid reference, because without that, we don't really know where in Bangor or where on the Great Orme you might have seen this plant. So I think that I know Delyth is going to explain more about this. And then the when, the date. It's always good to give a nice accurate date when you've seen a plant, particularly if it's flowering at an unusual time, because that also gives Delyth a bit more confidence about verifying a record. So if you say that it's flowering and it's out of season, then questions can be asked. You know, is that correctly identified, or why is it flowering at a funny time of year? Possibly isn't that species. Always good to give the most accurate date you can give, but obviously if you've only got the month or season even, probably these less accurate dates are better if you're extracting information out of literature sources. So some of the early publications might not necessarily give you a day. It might only be the year or the month. You've got no option in that case. You have to use them, but always go for this end of the spectrum, really. Then the who. Always put your name down so you know who's recorded it. Obviously, your full name is the best. If you don't know who's recorded it, put an on. If it's say you've heard of somebody recording it, or it's written down in a book somewhere, that's probably the way to go. But like my garden, me is not really acceptable, I don't think, in a record, because in 200 years' time, nobody's going to know who me or my garden relates to. So just bear that in mind. So why do we record? Well, there's lots of different reasons why we record. So I think primarily it's personal interest, isn't it? A lot of us are hobbyists who like to go out for walks and like to record what we see. So great justification for recording. There's also conservation reasons. You might want to help record where some of the rare species are, and so we can preserve them. And obviously you're feeding into species atlases too, and all this information is useful because your own records might only be a small area, but when they're all amalgamated with records from other people from across Britain or across Denbighshire, you start to be able to produce useful maps and trends about how things are changing over the years. So always worth thinking that you may only be recording one or two specimens, like, oh, I've seen such and such an orchid here, and by itself it may not be that interesting, but with other people's records together, it becomes quite powerful information. What to record? Well, I've got a nice picture of an invasive there. Always good to know where these invasives are, because then people can potentially go and control them. So things like Himalayan balsam, New Zealand water stonecrop, Japanese knotweed, that sort of thing. And unless we know where they are, with people that need to go out and control them don't know where to focus their attention and efforts. So that's another reason it's not just recording our naturalized native plants, it's also looking out for these problematic ones too. So there's things that are common now that may not be common in the future. So don't assume that we don't want records of common things, because common things now may not be in the future. Things can change. Rarities are always interesting, things outside of the range that you've not heard of. And yeah, getting that long-term trend information is good as well. So how are things faring? Maybe with climate change, we're getting winners and losers. Some species will be expanding, some species will be contracting. And unless we've got that continuity of records coming in, people won't be able to look back over the years and see how things have changed. So do bear that in mind. So go for some of the common stuff too. I'd say don't record everything. Probably not particular to plants, but sometimes you may be able to record lots of records of one species from one site in one day, but clearly for plants that isn't really realistic. This is more for sort of entomology and things like that. And then where do you find out a bit more information about your records? Well, there's a nice system called a DERIN. This is free to use. It's all the 4 Welsh record centres amalgamate their data into one area. And you can go on to this website for free and map particular species. It won't give you the rare and protected species, the ones that are sort of very rare for obvious reasons, but it will give you most species. And it's a good way of just checking if you've found something new to an area based on our biological record centres data. It's also nice in that it will give you a species numbers in squares as well, so that can help guide your recording, because you may want to focus your effort on an under-recorded square, and this is a good way of doing it. So it'll tell you which squares have got the fewest records and where you can maximise your recording effort, I suppose. So have a visit on that. You don't have to log in or register, you can just use it straight, and very straightforward to use. And I'm sure Delyth will tell you a bit more about some of the other systems like the SBI, so I won't mention them particularly now. So I think at this point I shall hand you over to Aisling, who will tell you more about the COVNOD systems.
So yeah, we have over 5.5 million records, and the number of records increases all the time. But of course, we're not just worried about the total number of records. It's the having a really good spread across the area we cover, and having a good range of different species groups as well. And we do find, of course, that there is a predominance of certain species groups in the database, and currently that would be birds, where there are almost half of the records we hold are bird records, but then they are well recorded species groups. But plants are actually follow birds in second place at the moment, with almost 1 million plant records that we hold. Now, we know we don't have copies of every record that could be of relevance, but we are fortunate to have good relationships with county recorders across North Wales who share their databases with us in particular. So yeah, out of the 1 million plant records, that does include the non-vascular plants, the mosses and the liverworts, etc. But most of them are of flowering plants, ferns and conifers, the type of plant that we're talking about today with Delyth. Richard's already mentioned Aderyn, the Wales website, the Wales Record Centre's website, where you can go and have a look at the distribution of particular plant species. So that's useful to know, because that actually helps you see where there are gaps. So you might think that there's a species that's obviously you might think is very well recorded, but if you have a look on that website and bring up a distribution map of that particular species, you might find that where you live, it's not been recorded, but you know that it is there. So that's quite a nice website to become familiar with as well. And then we also, of course, hold records of lots of different species groups. Now, how do records end up in the COFNOD database? There are actually two routes. So the first is the online recording system, which is what I'm going to show you more about today. But also we can import data from spreadsheets, and these spreadsheets might come from other databases. So that's how a lot of the plant data actually does end up in our database. When we look across the whole database, about 92% of it is imported from spreadsheets. And with plant data, it's a little bit less than that, it's about 87%, which means that 12% of the plant records we hold does come through the online recording system, which means it is a really important route for plant data getting onto the database. And who provides those data to us for plants? Well, by far the majority of the records really do come from the county recorders, which I'll show you who they are in a moment. We also have quite a bit of plant data that comes from targeted surveys of specific areas by organisations. Now, it might be an organisation like NRW that's, or before that CCW, where they might commission what they call phase 2 surveys, for example, which are very detailed plant surveys of certain areas, or it might be from consultants that are going out and maybe doing a less detailed survey, but a survey nonetheless where they're trying to record a lot of plant species on a particular site. So they might be very small areas, or they might be larger areas too. And then another key source, I think, of plant data is what we term bioblitzes and recorders days. So you might have heard of some of these. You've probably maybe been to one or two of these in the past. The bioblitzes tend to be more aimed at engaging members of the public, and the recorders days more getting specialists out on sites that they wouldn't normally get to. But what they tend to do is they target, again, a very specific area and try and record everything there. So that obviously includes quite a number of plants in most cases. And then we come to individuals who might or might not be plant specialists. So they may be people like yourselves. Some of you might be very generalist recorders, might record lots of different species groups, but within that you may wish to record some plants. And some other individuals, really it is plants that they focus on, and that's what they do record. But all of these sources really important for the COFNOD database. And many of the records, it's worth saying, do require verification by the relevant county recorder. So unless they've come to us from a very specialist survey, it is likely that a county recorder such as Delyth would look at those records, and not so much for the easy to identify species, but for the more difficult ones, have a look at them, see if there's anything that maybe needs any more confirmation, perhaps a plant that wouldn't normally be recorded in that area, something like that. And we'll come on to some of the bits of evidence that you can submit with your record, that predominantly photos, but that will help make it easier for somebody like Delyth to confirm that your record is correct. So who are the plant record verifiers in North Wales? So the little map on the left here shows that there are 5 vice counties in North Wales, and the vice counties, you may be familiar with these. They are used mostly by recording schemes and societies now, including the BSBI, the plant society that Delyth is the county recorder for. But in the past, way back, they were the old county boundaries, and that's where they came from. So there are 5 vice counties: Merionethshire, Carnarvonshire, Denbighshire, Flintshire and Anglesey. The ones that share their names with modern counties don't necessarily cover the same area, apart from Anglesey, which does, of course, but Denbighshire and Flintshire aren't exactly the same as the counties of Denbighshire and Flintshire, and you'll notice that there's no Wrexham there because it's included mostly within the Denbighshire Vice-county. Now, the Vice-county recorders that are active at the moment for plants are for Vice-county 48, which is Merioneth, Joe Clark and Heather Garrett. For Carnarvonshire, Wendy McCarthy, that's Vice-county 49. For Vice-county 50, which is Denbighshire, Delyth. Then for Flintshire, Emily Mayer and Gail Courtney Bishop. And for Anglesey, Ian Bonner and Nigel Brown. And if you want to check for any species group who the county recorder is, there's a web address here that we can share with you afterwards, and I can share this presentation as well, in fact. And it's just a little bit on our website where you can click on that page and then click on Find a Local Expert, and you can check who the relevant county recorders are for certain species groups. So that's just a little bit of it shown there. So how do you go about submitting plant records to COVNOD if you're not doing so already? So the COVNOD online recording system is a really good starting point because you can enter records for all kinds of different species groups. It's also used for specific monitoring projects, which I'll, some of them being public projects, but also often for groups where there's specific access. So I know there's 1 or 2 people here today from the Holcombe Conservation Group. So that's a good example of a group where there's a small number of individuals with access to a specific form. They can enter their records and they can see each other's records, and it just becomes a nice place to share records with each other, as well as keeping them nicely labeled as belonging to that group. So if anyone is interested in further special forms like that, just contact me. The other thing is that the records are available immediately to the county recorder and also for use in data outputs that COVNOD produce for all kinds of reasons across North Wales. We can also import data from an email attachment, such as a spreadsheet, or in fact, if it's a very large file, you can get it to us in another way, a big file for a transfer or something like that. But basically, if it's in a spreadsheet, there's no point entering it again into the ORS because we can import it and we can still make it available for you for viewing in the same way as you would see other records that you put in to the ORS. Then a couple of other ways that you can submit records. So you may have come across the Lurk Wales app, and there's a link to the details from the COVNOD website. So there are a few advantages of using this because it's a proper app, so you can use it in the field even if you don't have any mobile coverage. However, there is a delay in those records being available to us and also to the county recorder because it goes into, the data goes into a different database, which is actually the iRecord database. So again, you may have used iRecord. They have there's a website, it covers the whole of the UK, and it is used heavily for certain species groups and for certain projects. And if you are using it for those projects, then that's absolutely fine. And there's no need to submit the records twice to us separately because we will have access to those records. But there is just a bit of a delay. So I would say for the more ad hoc records, it's probably best to use the COVNOD ORS. But yeah, the basic message is that you shouldn't have to submit twice, and do get in touch if you want me to check on a specific instance. The other thing to say is that Now that we have the new online recording system, you can actually use it on your phone in the field. So it's a bit like an app, although not quite at that point. The only issue is that if you don't have mobile phone coverage, you can't use it. Whereas a proper app, I think it stores the details in your phone until you do have coverage. But, you know, as long as you've got coverage and you've got a GPS switched on in your phone, you can use it pretty effectively in the field. So that's also worth bearing in mind. So I'm going to now stop sharing this and go straight across to the online recording system to show you. So I'll just click stop share there and switch over to here. And can you see the ORS login page? Yep, thanks, Richard. So if you don't have a password yet, it only takes a few moments to register. You need to put in your email address and set a password, and I don't think there's much else you need to put in. Once you do have your details, you would go to the login page, log in, and then you would see a page like this, which is the main welcome page of the ORS. And there is a little message there, in fact, about using the ORS on your smartphone in the field. So yeah, worth knowing about that. So there's not a lot showing at the top here. There's a few different options. You've got enter records, view records, and more. Now more has a couple of things like the interactive map and the species dictionary. So the interactive map I'll show you in terms of entering records, but if you ever want to use it just on its own, that's where you get it. And the species dictionary, again, it's linked in with, of course, entering records. But if you do want to just go into the system and look up the name, the scientific name, the Welsh name, or the English name of a particular species, this is a good place to do it. And the nice thing about it is oops, what's happened there? Hang on. It's kicked me out for some reason. The nice thing about it is that it shows everything in a hierarchy, so you can see how individual species fit in to you know, the higher levels. So if we go to plants here and say we go to pteridophytes, everything's kind of done in a nice hierarchy. So you can search for an individual species. So let's say polypody, which is a fern. And then you can see that it fits within this genus, this family, this order, etc., etc. So if you ever want to know how different species relate to each other, this can be quite useful. Okay, so I'll move over to enter records. And the option that you'll see at the top for everybody is standard entry, which I'll show you in more detail. But you'll also see some public projects here, and there aren't really any that are particularly relevant to plants, apart from record an alien, where there's Japanese knotweed is one of the options in there. But you may see other ones pop up over time. And basically these projects, they aim to just get a little bit more detail about certain species and species groups because there's a particular project underway, probably with an outside partner who has asked us to set something up. So just worth knowing that they are there and you might see something of interest. But if I go first of all to standard entry, this is the ORS data entry form. Now it might look a little complicated to start with, but don't panic, because if you can see the little asterisks next to the names over on the left here, it's really only the ones that have those asterisks where you actually need to put something in. So once you get used to it, you'll find that there's really not very much that you have to put in for a record. Although if you have more information, it's always useful to add it. But at the very basic level, we just need to know what you've seen, where you've seen it, who you are, or if it's not your record, then whose record it is, when it was, and anything else possibly at the end. So it is very much the who, what, where, when that makes up the record. So we'll look at the what to start with, and I have a few species records to put on to show you. Now, one thing to explain as well is that if you have a photograph, say you've been out in the field and you've taken some photographs, it's sometimes a good place to start by actually uploading that to start with. So if I click upload a file, and I've got an image of bluebell here, which it's popped in here for me. And in some cases, it will then pop up a message and ask you if you want to use the location details and the date from that photograph to fill in the relevant bits of the form. So it's sometimes worth starting with that and then working right through. In this case, there isn't any information attached, so that's fine. So it's bluebell I'm looking for. So I'm just going to start typing in bluebell at the top here. And because I put blue bee, I've got everything that starts with that. But if I keep typing bluebell, it will cut it down to just anything that has bluebell in the name. So you'll often see some options at the bottom which say infrequently recorded. If you hover over it, it will tell you that what that means really is that there are very few records of this species in the database. So it's very unlikely to be that species that you should be recording, really. It's just to stop accidental entry of things, just because maybe the common name is very similar, but it's actually not the right species. So in this case, I'm looking for the native bluebell. So I'm going to pick the top one here, and it's now popped into the box, and it's also labeled it here as flowering plant, because sometimes the same names do pop up in different kingdoms, the same common name. So a good example is the magpie, which can be a bird or a moth, but there are a few things with plants as well where they might pop up in other species groups. So just worth making sure that, yes, you've got the right thing here. Now, we've also got a confidence rating here. So long as you're putting in your own record, you're going to know how confident you are in the identification. So in this case, I'm going to say I was certain, but if you weren't certain, you might still put the record in and say you were very unsure. And that would mean that the county recorder would definitely look at that record, and it wouldn't be used unless they could confirm that that's what it was. Now, the county recorder has a kind of priority system that we run in the database, so that if species are on a very easy to identify list, then they probably won't be looked at by the county recorder, unless you've done something like set a very low confidence, or unless it's not been recorded in that area before. So that will also prioritize it for looking at. So worth knowing that as well. And then there's a new box here, new to the new ORS, which asks you to tick it if you've made your identification using an app. So we find that that's quite useful for county recorders and ourselves to know, because yeah, some apps I suppose are more reliable than others, and it just might mean that the county recorder might look at it a bit more carefully. So do tick that if you've used an app to make your identification. And then we've got a few more options that are optional, as it were. So we've got, you can put a count in if you want, but with plants, that's not used that often, unless it's something very rare and it is important to count the individual plants. But you might use a scale such as DAFOR or Domin, and I think Delyth is going to mention one of those later. But I suppose the more usual one that you're going to use is maybe to say that it was flowering or something like that, but you don't have to put anything there. You've got the option to set a negative record, but again, that's not really used unless you're doing a monitoring project and you've specifically gone out and really searched an area and you know that that species isn't there. So you probably won't use that. Record type is another optional one. So that could be useful to say that you've taken a voucher specimen. I'm sure Delyth may mention a bit more about that later on. And then there's also the option of a sampling method, which in fact there's nothing there for plants, because this tends to just bring up the most used options for different species groups. But if you're putting a bird record in or something, there might be something there, like I think camera trap is one of the options for birds. Anyway, you probably won't use that sampling method, but you might use the record type to say you've got a voucher specimen. Okay, so that's the what bit done. you then need to think about where was it. So if you've got a photograph uploaded and it has taken the location details from the photo, then it's still worth kind of trying to refine it a bit, because it will be a fairly vague grid reference, and it's also worth checking it because sometimes phones coverage aren't 100% accurate. So I would always recommend clicking on the map, even if you've already got your grid reference, or maybe you know what it is. So I'm going to just put in something quite random here and then click on the map to see where that ends up. Hopefully not in the sea, but it might do. No, yeah, it has ended up somewhere completely random. So you can also just click on the map. So I'm going to click in here, click OK, and you can use your mouse wheel to zoom in, which I'm going to do now. Or you can also use the plus and minus symbols here on the screen to zoom in and out. Now, it doesn't seem to be terribly happy here. I'm wondering what's going on. Hopefully the mapping is working. It was certainly working yesterday. That's a bit better now. Yeah, okay. So let's say that the record was from here. It does seem when I zoom in that it's not bringing up what it should do, but you can switch across to aerial photographs. So anytime you want, you just use your mouse to hover on the bottom left of the screen and change the map type. So you can switch between ordnance survey and aerial photograph. And when you're zoomed right in, the aerial photograph is really useful because you might then be able to say exactly where you were, which is important for the rare species and the things that are, maybe just one or two individuals there. But if it was something that was widely scattered across this field, you might just be going for, possibly a 6-figure grid reference. So this mapping is handy because it shows you exactly where the grid reference covers. So if I was to zoom in a bit further and do an 8-figure grid reference, it would show me that it was literally that bit of the field. So you can then insert grid reference and it'll pop it back into the thing here. So use the map and use it to check, even if you do know the grid reference. And the grid reference type will generally default to selected from interactive map if you've looked at the map and clicked on it. But there are a few other options there you can use if you like. Now the site name is important, and Richard mentioned earlier that saying something like my field or my garden is not that useful. It needs to be something that will enable somebody to make sure that that grid reference matches that site if there's ever any doubt, because it is possible to make mistakes with the grid reference, particularly when you don't check it on the map. So if you've got a site name of I don't know, Holyhead, and you've put in a grid reference that's clearly over in St. Asaph or something, then it rings alarm bells and somebody can check it. And it may sometimes be something like someone's put the wrong letter code at the beginning of the grid reference or something like that. It's as simple as that. So we'll put in a site name here of where I was particularly, let's say Pentraeth. And then moving over to the right of the form, the next bit is who made the record, and it defaults to the person who's logged in. So I'm actually logged in as a pretend ORS user called Sally Moss, but if you're logged in, it will default to your name. But you can change that if you like. You just have to delete it and then put in somebody else. And you can also have several recorders. You just click on add another recorder and type in what you want there. And if you've found that you've typed something into a box and then you think, oh no, that's wrong, I want to get rid of it, you just click on the little rubbish bin symbol to the right of it. So I'll do that. So it's back to Sally Moss. Now you'll see add a determiner on the far right there. Now that's really important for a lot of plant records, because you might have had the specimen looked at by somebody else, or you might have sent a photograph or two to somebody else. And so although you are the recorder, you've actually had it determined by somebody else. So do put the name of the determiner in there if there is somebody in that category. There may not be, but if there is, do fill it in. Then the date, that's quite easy. Ideally, you use a full date, but if you, for some reason, don't know exactly when it was, you could put something in with the month. and year, or even occasionally the year, but it's really, really best to put the full date if you can. And then notes can go in there, anything else that you think is relevant. And it could be something that really tells the county recorder why you knew it was that particular plant and not something that was very similar or something like that. Or it might say you'd used a particular reference book maybe to confirm the ID, something like that. And then click Submit Record. Now, once you've submitted it, you'll see a pop up at the bottom of your screen. And this is a good opportunity to check that it looks okay. So you've got your species name there. You've got a confidence level of very unsure, which in this case for demonstration purposes, I've put that in. You've also got the symbol showing that an app was used to determine the species. And you've got a little paperclip showing that there are attachments. So if I click on that, it's showing me the photograph of the bluebells. Now, I'm sure Delyth will mention this, but sometimes you need a number of photographs. And even then, sometimes it's not enough to confirm that that was that species, but it is possible to put multiple photos in. So it may be that you need to show particular features of the plant and take one or two different photos and upload those. You've got your date here, you've got your grid reference. If I click on that, I can just check that that is correct. And then the rest of the information here that you've entered. So that's just one record, and you might be thinking, well, that's taking quite a long time. But if you've got a list of different species from one site, there are some tricks that will help you enter those records really quickly. So it's always possible, if you put a record in, to click on this little cog thing here, and well, you can edit it if you spot that you've made a mistake. You can also delete it, but also you can copy it. So if I click copy, it will then put all the information back up into this form, and it says, you know, make sure that you do make the changes before you submit it, because you obviously don't want to submit 2 copies of exactly the same record. But in this case, I'm going to say, okay, at that site, I also recorded 1 or 2 other things. So I'm actually going to look at my files here, and I've got Dogs Mercury as well. So I'm going to pop that in and see if I can find that on the species list. And possibly it's a difficult one. There we go. It's got a, yeah, it's just because occasionally the formatting makes it a little bit more difficult to find things. But I could always put in Mercury if I didn't find it, putting in dogs there, and there we got Dogs Mercury, second option there. So because I've got a few records I want to put in from this site, what I can do is I can lock down all this information here. So I'm going to lock down the grid reference type, the site name, the recorder. I think I'll just put a more detailed date here, but I'll lock that down because I know I've got a couple more, and then I'm going to leave the test thing blank. But the fields that I've locked down, you'll see now when I submit the record. So the record's now down here, Dogs Mercury, but in my form, I've still got all the information about where the record was, who it was, and when it was. So now it's quite quick to come along and see, okay, what else do I want to put on? Ramsons, okay. I'm just going to type in Ramsons into the dictionary box there, click on it. I can change the confidence. In this case, I'm going to say I was certain, and submit record. And now I've got 3 records. So you can see how quick that is once you've locked things down. So if you've got a list of species from one particular site, you lock down all the information on where it was, who you were, when it was, etc. The other way around might also work, that you might have lots of records of a particular species from lots of different sites. So you lock down the species name, but then you change the other information. So you'll get used to that, but you can basically lock any field down by clicking on the padlock, and to unlock it, you just click it again. So I'm going to unlock the where information now and upload something else. I've got ground ivy. Let's just do that. Oops. I'm going to put it somewhere else so that we can have a look at what the data looks like when we got lots of different locations. So let's put something over here. and zoom in with my mouse wheel and click here. Let's say it was here, insert grid reference, and change the name. I don't know, just make something up, and submit record. I might lock that one down there. Submit record. Oh, I have to choose a confidence level. So if it ever doesn't submit, you'll see there might be a bit of red text comes up somewhere on the form because you've forgotten to do something. So that's just reminding me. So I'll set the confidence level and submit record. I think I've got one more to put in here. Greater Stitchwort. And again, I'm going to search for the name. In this case, another trick is that you might want to say, okay, lots of things starting with greater, but I just want to look at the flowering plants. So you click on flowering plant there and you see all the flowering plants that start with that. So hopefully my Stitchwort is there. There we go. Confidence. I'm going to put in an abundance this time. Although, yeah, well, in fact, you can put text in here. So you could say something like frequent or something. You could type it into that box if you wanted to. Then I think I'll change the grid reference again somewhere else. Pop it over here and submit record. Now I have 5 records here, so it's worth me showing you what it looks like if, you know, once you start to build up the records that you've put in, you can then look at view records, click on standard entry, and you will see all the records that you've put on over time. And so this is a good place to keep these records and keep an eye on them. And you can do lots of useful tricks once you've got the data in here. So for example, I might want to map all the records. So I've got a tools button at the top right, click on that, map all records, and it should bring me up a nice little map showing where all these records are. Hopefully, yeah. So you will get an initial page here, which generally speaking, just click continue to the map, but it does explain on the bottom right there what these different colors mean. So the green means records are in use. The yellow means records are awaiting checks. So if I zoom right in here, I actually put multiple records here. So if I click on that, I can see that there's 3 species recorded at that grid reference. And I might want to look in that one in more detail. So I click on that and then I get the full detail up of the record. So it's a really useful way of keeping track of your own records and where they are. The other thing you can do is change the points to squares. So it just, again, it's showing the actual extent of the grid reference when I log in. So that's a very detailed one. Yeah, so the other points are over here. I'll close the map down. Other things you might like to do are to export the records into Excel if you know, if it's something that you use that you want to do something further with it. You know, this is like the top copy on the ORS, but you can export data and do things with it in Excel if you want to. The other thing that could be useful, obviously it's a bit pointless when you've only got 5 records here, but if you've got lots of records here and you click on species list, you get a little summary. So it's showing us how many records of each species you have in here. And if you click filter, it will filter to those records and just show you those records. So if I had lots and lots of records of dogs mercury all over the place and I clicked filter, it would then bring that down. So I could just see the records of that species and I could map that if I wanted to. You've got all kinds of options with filters up here if you want to drill down to see different species, and you've also got a little quick filter thing to the left of the species name, which means that you can easily click for records of this species name. So all records of greater stitchwort. So I've only got 1, but that's probably the most useful filtering that you might want to use. Yeah, I think that's about it really for a quick quick overview of the ORS for plant recording.
Hello there, everybody. I'm so sorry about this. I'm Delyth Williams, Vice-county recorder for PC50 Denbighshire, Denbighshire. Both Richard and Aisling have already gone through most of this already, but I just wanted to make a few points about how to record plants. If you can manage, I think you've seen the lists that have come up on the ORS entry thing, that there are an awful lot of common names for many different species, not just plants. So if you can manage to begin to learn the scientific names, that would be so much better. Why? Because common names aren't often accurate enough. Most of the ivy, for example, in the west of Wales, west from about here in Denbighshire, is in fact Hedera-hibernica. It's Atlantic ivy, and most people don't know that and just put down common ivy or ivy. And violets, for example, I'm going to be talking about that later. Which one? Well, there's quite a few. So if you're a beginner and you're starting and you're going to learn a name, try and have a look and start with the scientific ones. Speedwell's case in point, there's about a dozen of them. Scientific name is Veronica. Well, that's just as easy to learn as Speedwell, I think. Having said that, do give it a go and do check them out every time you enter them and have a look at the scientific. But in the end, you have to use whichever sticks in the mind. If you're going to record plants, yes, please send in your records. But we don't need the most common daisies, grass, dandelions even. We don't need all those, unless of course you're doing it as part of a survey, in which case we do need all of it. But you may want to record a common plant because you have another interest other than plants, because it might be a food plant or a pollen source or something of interest in another capacity, and I think that's really useful. You might be wanting to add that to the notes, the fact that you've recorded, for example, common dog violet is because you're interested in is it the pearl bordered fritillaries that use that as a food source. So that's another reason. We talked about invasive. Yes, please, we need to know the invasives, even whether they're getting terribly common or not, but any invasive record. But as a general rule, if you're out and learning, enjoying plants, record anything that appeals to you, that you think is interesting, that's different or a bit on the rare side. So yes, please, let's have those records. Thank you. Next, please. Yes, please. We've talked about dates before. It really does matter. And if you're not quite sure of the date, you may put in the first of the month. Why not? Because it really messes up the data I have to work with. The computer doesn't like it. We do need full days, month and years. And it's also extremely useful for looking at phenology, which is flowering times. And you may be interested to know that that's not the New York Police Department, that's the New Year Plant Hunt, which occurs on the 1st to the 4th of January every year, where we record plants that are actually in flower on that day. And believe it or not, on the banks of the Dee in the village of Holt this year, we recorded 56 different plants that were actually in flower. Yet again, testament of plants hanging on through the winter, flowering still. Again, you know, evidence of climate change. And dates are useful as well, because if you've got to distinguish the fragrant orchids, flowering time is really important. So we do need to know, you know, precise dates for those. And it also helps me verifying. Sometimes I get, for example, people recording ivy leaf speedwell in August. I don't think so. It's been and gone by then. It's an annual and it will have died. So that's often also helps me corroborate identification. Where really important, we've talked about this already, grid references. If they're common and you're just going for a walk and you want to make some few notes, 1 kilometre square is enough. Most of the time my records will be 6-figure. That's to 100 metres square. But really, if you're talking about anything that's rare or scarce, that's not quite enough. 8 figures would be good, even better. I don't think there's any point in bothering with 10-figure grid references most of the time, because quite frankly, the GPS systems aren't that accurate. And also plants, if they're annuals, they move about a bit. No, they don't move. They crop up in different places from year to year. And they spread and this, that and the other. So you don't need to go any higher than an 8-figure grid reference. You will need to put a place name, as has been discussed, and that is really important. Please look at the OS map and choose the closest, nearest name from the OS map to where your grid reference is. And why do we do that? Well, mostly because it corroborates your grid reference, and as I think Ashling's already pointed out, there's an example. People make mistakes, misread figures, etc., and sometimes we end up in the middle of the sea. But if you've got a place name there, it's quite possible that it means Abergele. And conversely, Aberwyn is a huge area. It's no good putting that down. We need to know which bit of Aberwyn it is. So please use the OS maps for a name. If you need to be a bit more specific, then it's important to add directions. Here are some examples. You've already put your 6-figure grid reference down. We know it's in the, let's say, in the Abergele square, but you might want to say a few metres south of the junction, or between a gate and a post box. By Bryn Mawr Farm, that name may not be on the OS map, but you've seen it, but so you can make a note of it. It's really important. Why? Because especially if you've got rare plants or scarce ones that we want to keep an eye on, or even just interesting ones, it's so that somebody else, yourself included, can go out and find it again next time, later in the season, next year. And here's a lovely example of this stunning little plant. This is moonwort. It is rare, Patricium lunaria. And the recorder, Alan Brandon there, has given me actually an 8-figure grid reference and a place name, which is fine, but this is growing in the middle of a field. And he said, look at that, 16 plants found on the side of a track, 10 metres below, 160 paces below a footpath style. So the chances of refinding that are going to be high. So that's good. Thank you. What else you might want to add in the notes box? Habitat's helpful. Where you found it. Well, why? It's going to be interesting if you get plants growing in habitat not expected. It helps me when I'm verifying. I'm not going to find sea holly in a bog, for example. So maybe somebody's made a mistake. It's important, if you can, especially for the scarcer, rarer plants, to put in something about abundance. That's how many, how much, and distribution or frequency, where do they occur? And it's useful to know. A few scattered plants on the verge, for example. There's a photo of a quarry. You might have thousands of orchids on that quarry floor. A single large clump is really, really useful. Why? So that we can go back later on in the season, next year, 10 years time, who knows, to get some indication of a spread or a decrease, or even, in fact, most of the time, a loss of these species over time. You may use the Dafour scale, which looks incredibly rough and ready, but it is very useful. I can't remember the percentages myself now, but if you're in a particular area, dominant means the plant occurs about 90% of the coverage. That'll be a bluebell in a bluebell wood, for example. Rare means you've only got 1 or 2, and all the others make an educated estimate of where you're going to be finding it on your verge, in your quarry, in your woodland, for example. And again, that's really, really useful for future reference. rather than just recording that your plant is there. Thank you. Who? Yes, please. We need your full name, especially if you've got a surname like mine. Why? Well, so that you can be credited with the record, obviously. Secondly, so that I can validate it, because I can't validate an anonymous record. It's really not really much use at all, to be honest. And if necessary, so that you can be contacted if there's possibly an issue with identification or needing actually more data. I do that quite a lot. Please, can you tell me more about what you've found? Where do you send your records to? Yes, Ashley's told you where you can send them, Covnod. You may also, lots of recorders send their records directly to me, to the Vice-county recorder, spreadsheet preferably. And all my records eventually, as do Covnod's, end up in the SBI database, and then they go on there to the National Biodiversity Network. Sorry, I just wanted to say, please note though that we don't send them in twice. Either send them to me, to the recorder, or to Covnod, but not to both. We only put records in once. Well, when you're going out recording, why would you be wanting to do it anyway? You could be on a walk. Lots of the recorders send me records because they see them, but their main interest, you might be a birder or you're interested in fungi, something else, and they see something nice, and I get these incidental, casual records, which is brilliant. You might be taking part in a survey. I think we've got people from Holkin here, so you'll be, I'm not sure, recording just whether a species is there or not in a, let's say, a square or along a verge, or I don't know, on a beach or some known area. But you could be recording as part of a more detailed survey where you're going to be looking at, yes, frequency and abundance and the distribution of plants over a course of time in a certain place. It could be a lot more detailed than that. So there's various different levels of recording, if you like. But please make sure you know which one you're doing. So if you are in a survey, then you need to know what we're recording. And obviously, as I'm sure you can see from that, most of my recording for BSBI is recording presence in an area I don't have time to go into, or possibly don't need to go into any greater detail. But I'm sure you'll appreciate that your focus provides very, very different types of data, which that's just how it is. That's a statement of fact, and it's all useful. All of it comes in useful in the end. So, well, why do we do it anyway? It's mainly to provide distribution information, evidence of all sorts of things. We need to look at increase in range or decline. It's very interesting to notice, not so much around here, but certainly in parts of Southeast England, for example, how the number of natives is declining and the alien plants are increasing. So we've got data checking on that. It must be useful, I should have thought, to inform host plants, pollinators, predators, other life forms which depend obviously on the plants. So that's why we need to know where the plants are in the first place. And yeah, are our environmental and agricultural policies, what sort of effect are they having? And needless to say, since the Second World War, the number of different species in this country has declined drastically. But there we are. But most of all, it's really, really enjoyable. It's terrific therapy getting out there, looking for plants, finding something any single day of the year. So just do it for that, if nothing else. What are the pros of recording plants? Well, I think they're stunningly beautiful and interesting most of the time. I have to say I can't warm to giant hogweed, but there you go. They don't move, so they're quite easy to study, and they're easy to photo, or are they? I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But you can go out any day of the year and find something of interest in any weather. I've talked about the New Year plant hunt. You'd be amazed what you can find in the Tesco car park, and I have spent quite a lot of time loitering with intent around bus stops and places like that as well. You can find interesting stuff anywhere. And you can, unlike most other life forms, you can take them home to study and identify, which I do a lot. That's fine, but please remember it's illegal to uproot anything. And if you are going to take something to identify, please use your sense. If there's only one or two, don't take anything, and make sure that you leave plenty behind. Also be aware that a lot of plants are poisonous or irritant, especially the umbellifers. Just have that at the end. So yes, please use your common sense, but by all means take a leaf or a flower to take it home and have a proper look at it. Thank you. What are the cons? Well, there's thousands of them. And learning names, especially scientific names, puts people off. And learning how to identify them puts a lot of people off as well, because it is actually quite hard work. But I'm not going to dwell on that because I think the effort put into it is worth it. I don't remember all the names, especially at my stage in life. I'm dropping names off at the end and forgetting more and more of them as I go along. But it's worth it. It's worth it every single time, especially if you can learn how to identify them yourself. But I think the pros outweigh the cons. These are the plants that plant forms that we record at the SBI. We don't do we don't do mosses or algae, most of them, but we do ferns. We do all conifers. We do the flowering plants, angiosperms, that's monocots, rushes, the sedges, the grasses, and the bulby plants, daffodils and things. And we do the dicotyledonous plants. Those are herbaceous plants, shrubs and trees. And herbaceous plants are what most people look at, the ones with the flowers on. Oh gosh, where do I start? Well, I wouldn't start with the sedges or the grasses, frankly. Stick with the ones that have got nice flowers on, where they are easier, more attractive and easier to learn, more obvious. So what do you need? Well, get yourself a hand lens. You can't go anywhere without a hand lens. If you've never used one to look at a flower, you should start now, because it opens up a whole new wonderful world. They're available, they're cheap, about £5 or £6 I think. Some of them got lights in, very easy, inexpensive to use. You need a notebook or some mechanism of recording, and lots of these days more and more youngsters seem to be using apps on phones. I don't. I have a pencil and a piece of paper because I find that the most reliable. Battery doesn't run out. I don't lose signal. A pencil works in the rain. And it also means, as I am recording, I can scribble little notes to myself as I go along, and little pictures and little hints to help me remember the different shape of something. And then I input the data to the database when I get home. Some people use recording cards. They're okay, but they're in scientific names, and yet again you're a bit restricted as to how you can take your records. You must have an OS map or a GPS or some means, as we've discussed earlier, of recording the grid ref. You can, of course, use the ORS system, as Aisling has said, but I have an interactive map. It's called Memory Map. I mentioned it at the bottom. I think it's 25 quid for a certain area, which I don't recall, and it gives me the grid reference when I get home if I want to, and I find that really useful. And you may want some polythene bags, sealed freezer bags if you're going to collect specimens. Small specimens, I use urine sample bottles. They're brilliant, little screw top containers. I'd recommend what I used to call a dissecting microscope. They call them something else now. They're low power, but they're optional. And if you insist on going out in the rain, you do need waterproof paper, but I don't do that anymore either. So there you go. You can buy a loop. That's a graduated lens that gives you helps you to you can see the size of specimens. But again, they're all option. All you need is a hand lens and a notebook. Simple. Oh, and suitable clothing, obviously. Yes, well, we know that, don't we? Oh yes, I wanted a little word about photos. People send me all sorts of lovely photos, but for me, or indeed anybody else, to identify and verify plants that don't always work. Why not? Well, I can't feel it, I can't smell it, and I can't see where it grows. So useful. Often I can't see in enough detail the bits I need to see. That's why we use a hand lens a lot. And I can't be confident that the photo I've been sent is what the recorder thinks it is. So what do I do with that? Well, if I'm not confident, it doesn't get accepted. There's no point saying it could be. So what do? I write back to the recorder and I say, well, it could be, but I'm not sure, and I need a bit more ID. I need a specimen, a voucher specimen, please, in the post, or can you send me a better photo that shows me the bits I need to see? My advice is, rather than sending a photo and putting the onus of identification onto your dear verifier, please learn to use identification keys. I'm not going to talk about those today. I think that's probably worth another talk. But do learn to use the keys and learn what the features are, the diagnostic features of identifying the plant for yourself. And believe me, I still do it. I can, most of the time I know most of the plants in Denbighshire now, but I sometimes forget. Sometimes I find something I haven't seen before, and I still take bits home and I key them out so that I'm absolutely certain I've got the identification correct. I found one the other day actually, and I didn't recognise it, and I've had to bring it home and get all my books out and get the hand lens out and track it down, which I did. So yes, here's a photo that somebody sent me. Thanks. It's a conifer. Oh yeah, well, it could be a cypress. Can't get any further than that, sorry. I can do. Next please. Yeah, think it's an onion, allium. Looks pretty. I can't do anything with it though, sorry. Next one. Oh, that's better. That's a violet. How do I know it's a violet? Because it's a nice pretty violet colour. I can see 2 rabbit's ear petals sticking up at the top and 3 petals at the bottom. I can see the heart-shaped leaves, and yep, it's a violet, but there's about 12 of them. Which one's it going to be? Can't be sure. Right, recorder's given me a date. That's early. That's early in the year. Oh, that's a bit, another clue. Okay. It's Flusvine. For those of you who don't know, Flusvine is on the coast and it's on limestone. Oh, right, we've got another clue. That's really helpful. Recorder Tony tells me it's early dog violet, Viola reichenbachiana. Well, it could be. It could be sweet violet, Viola odorata, which also flowers early and it also grows on limestone. Well, it could be common dog violet, which probably isn't in flower at this time of year, but could grow in Clisfine. So really, I haven't got the picture yet, not quite sure. What happens now? Richard's going to press a button. Tony sent me this one as well. There's the clincher. He is correct. It is early dog violet. Flowers in February, grows on limestone. There's the flower, and the two clinchers there, which distinguish it from everything else, are the sepals, which are pointed. Oh, got an arrow. Pointed sepals, yes. Small sepal appendages sticking out of the back, tiny little ones. And that spur there that Richard's showing is dark, straight and notched, and it's dark purple, lovely colour, darker than the rest of the flower. Those two final features confirm without a shadow of a doubt that it is early dog violet. So if you're going to send me photos, what do I advise? Well, close-ups, helpful. A few other things there. It would be helpful if you could find out in your books what I'm looking for. I've just told you the diagnostic features for the violets. Another one is the forget-me-nots. You can't ID forget-me-nots without getting up close and personal with your hand lens. Believe me, you need to look at hairs. Nerdy or what, but it's true. And then you might be able to photo the relevant bits so that not just I can verify it, but you yourself will have learned how to identify the plant properly, which reminds me that lovely photo that Richard's put on the top right there. I'm sure most of you can see that that's gorse. You can almost smell it, can't you? But I don't actually know which gorse it is because I can't get close enough to see. It's probably Ulex europaeus. I don't know what the English for that is. Common gorse, I think. In Welsh, but it could be Ulex gallii, which is Western gorse. I don't think so. That's a bit paler. But without getting close up to look at the sepals, I can't be sure. So there's another case in point. So basic messages then: don't assume that taking your photos is the same thing as identifying it, and don't assume I'm going to be able to do it either. And I've banged on a bit about using keys. So there we go. Oh, what else do you need? Well, there are a whole load of books available. Collins field guides are fine if you're a beginner. Fitter and Fitter, it's Blamey Fitter and Fitter, Wildflowers of Britain and Ireland, is also a nice book. The one I still use to this day, and to my mind the best one of all, is Francis Rose, The Wildflower Key. Why? Because it has keys, identification keys, along with lovely drawings, obviously, within it that help you identify the plants. The downside of it is it doesn't do grasses and sedges, any of those, but I still use that to help me check things out. I wouldn't say it's a beginner's book, but if you're going to buy a book to help you, I'd go for that one. Quite old now, unfortunately. The Vegetative Key to the British Flora, Poland and Clement there. That is for when you've reached the stage where we have to ID things without the pretty flowers on. And it's quite high end, but it is very, very good. You do need to know your botanical language for that. Stace, The Flora of Britain and Ireland, is the big Bible. That's really high-end science, if I can put it like that. That's the one I use mostly. for identifying things. But if you're a beginner, don't go there. You'll probably want to slit your wrists. It is very learned, if I may put it like that. If you want to learn to identify the grasses, the sedges, the rushes and the ferns, Francis Rose also has a big hardback book, which I wouldn't take out in the field there, and that I'd strongly recommend, because the drawings are absolutely fantastic. And even if you're a bit put off by grasses, just look at the pictures and you've got a good chance of IDing one using that book. I'm sorry I don't have a photo of it there. There are loads of resources. I found a little book by Faith Anstey, which is a beginner's book. Field Studies Council do a terrific series on identifying common grasses, for example. There are loads of Facebooks. I'm afraid I don't do Facebook much myself, and I meant to and forgot to add the sites that you can find where you can identify plants using Facebook. I'm sure you know better than I do, most of you. No substitute for frankly, for getting a book though. And obviously I belong to the BSBI. The website, there it is absolutely terrific. There's tons of stuff on there helping you to identify plants, and it also offers loads and loads of different kinds of courses helping you to identify plants, ranging from beginners to you know, really obscure species. If you find that a bit frightening, have a look at the Plant Life website. They do a lot of really interesting good work, especially on conservation, and as do the Wildflower Society. And your best resource is to find a friend and join a group. Come and join us on one of our recording sessions, because you, as you all probably know, you learn most from other people. And there is a group of happy people peering at something. I can see a primrose. And there you go. What could be better than outside in the fresh air, looking at the wildflowers on your local patch? I thought of a few frequently asked questions. Yes, please send them to me or to Covnod. Check first your photos and send them in. If in doubt, send them in. Don't worry if it's really, really common, but if you want to send them in, please do. If you want to learn more, the National Plant Monitoring Scheme is designed for beginners. You get a tutor and you get help to identify plants within a square. You find out about that from Plant Life. It's a joint thing, Plant Life and BSBI. And the BSBI is also offering an IdentiPlant course. Again, provides a tutor. Can't remember how much it costs, not a lot, 30 quid, I think. And what I've forgotten to add there is, do please find out from Covnod the recording sessions that my fellow recorders offer, and you can join us and take part in real recording.